I'll do my best to keep us all awake over this next stretch, but I'm going to mute everyone.
Evangelical.
No, Tuesday.
Thursday.
No, Tuesday meeting.
Okay, I'm going to mute you all now. There you go. Hey, welcome everyone to this second session of our fall series on the history of American evangelicals. I'm going to give a little bit more preamble in just a minute, but let me start us with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for our history. We thank you for the people who have gone before. We thank you for the privilege that it is to study them and to learn from their victories and their not so victories, for the good things that they have done and for the mistakes they've made. God, we pray that we would always be people who are learning and testing and challenging and growing in our lives as your disciples. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So last week we got started. I'll talk a little bit about last week in just a few moments, but I'm reshaping a little bit of what we do as we move forward. Just a little clarification. We have 10 sessions together, and in these early sessions, we're talking about. We were in the 1700s last week. We're going to move into the 1800s this week. You'll notice that there's an imbalance in terms of how many weeks we spend on the 20th century, and that's for a couple reasons. One is I know more about the 20th century than I do about the others, so I'll be a better teacher on that century. But also, we are. I think most of us are interested in this topic right now because of the more recent history of American evangelicalism. And so some of this background is really so that we have a foundation for trying to understand what has happened in the last 100 years or so, and maybe even especially in the last 50. So all of this has value for us as we move ahead, but starting next week, we'll be looking at next week might be a little theology heavy, or Bible heavy, because we need to understand this one way of the way that evangelicals and fundamentalists understood and continue to understand the Bible if we're going to understand what's going on in our world. But that's next week. We've still got to get past the Second Great Awakening this time, and so I don't know if many of you have heard of a guy named George Barna. George Barna is a pollster. He does a lot of the same work that Gallup might do in the wider society, but he focuses on Christian groups and primarily evangelicals. George was a member of the church that I served before I came here, but he left back in the 80s. I think he's in Ventura now and has been there for a long time, running his company where they do surveys and crunch numbers and come up with data for studying evangelicalism. And as I said, he understands evangelicalism as an insider, as somebody who is there's a technical term for people who are evangelicals who write about evangelicals. They are participant observers. And so he does a lot of these studies and a lot of polling about evangelicalism. I'm going to share a graph here and talk about it just as we begin today. This is a recent poll just from a year or so ago. Can you see all four circles there? Somebody nod. Yeah? Okay. Because it's covering up all your faces now for me. This is a question about the overall perception or opinion of evangelicals. And for those of you who do numbers-based studies, this is a qualitative study as much as it is a quantitative study. So what he's measuring is people's impressions of evangelicals in the culture. And I want to focus on that circle on the right, because I think you'll see there that among people who are non-Christians, people who are either practice a different religion or something or no religion at all, you'll see that 47% of people have a negative or very negative impression of evangelicals. And worse, only 1% of non-Christian people, not Christian people, have a positive impression of evangelicals. I know that some of the people here in this class probably feel much the same way, and part of the point of this class is to give us a better rounded understanding of evangelicals and evangelicalism. But I want to say as we get started that I think the evangelicals of the 18th century and the 19th century, of the 1700s and 1800s, I think they'd be grieved by this chart. I think they would be wounded and disappointed by this impression of them. And tonight, as we look through the early 1800s and the Second Great Awakening, I'm going to give the early evangelicals a little bit of a chance to defend themselves tonight. So just as a review of what we did last week, we talked about a guy, a contemporary historian called David Bebbington, who was my professor, but who has developed a definition or a framework for understanding evangelicalism that is pretty important. And it's not the be all and end all, but it's a great place to start. And if you're out there reading books about evangelicalism, you know that David Bebbington is one of those authors that is quoted in the early pages. Almost everyone who writes about evangelicalism has to at least wrestle with David's definition. And here it is. Just we're going to review this a couple of times over the next few weeks, but David talks about these 4 characteristics of evangelicalism, and talks about biblicism, which is, as this person puts it, all essential spiritual truth can be found on its pages. I'm not exactly sure that's a great representation of David's view. David would say that it's a high view of Scripture, that you believe in some way that Scripture is an inspired document that God gave us to reveal something about God to us. Whether it's all, maybe all essential spiritual truth can be could be found in its pages. And then this idea of conversionism. This is what a lot of us would have maybe grown up with, that the idea that human beings have to be converted, that there is the threat of some sort of eternal separation from God if we are not converted, if we don't make a decision to follow Jesus in our own lives. And I get that raises all kinds of questions, but this is something that evangelicals believe strongly, and we're going to see it as we look at the Second Great Awakening today. And to skip to the last one, activism is the belief that once you believe in conversionism, the calling on your life as a Christian is to, in some way, share that faith and do the things that God has called us to do. If you've been at First Press on a Sunday, you know that one of the things I talk a lot about is who are we called to be because we follow Jesus Christ. And so that's the activism part of what we do. And then I always save this one for last because it's probably the most unfamiliar word, but Crucicentrism means that the teaching and the theology and the ways that you understand faith are rooted in what Christ does on the cross, that you believe that there is some cosmic event that happens on the cross, that Jesus somehow does save the world through the work on the cross. And so these are 4 things. All 4 of them need to be present in order for a person or teaching or group or church or school to be considered within the evangelical tradition. There are a lot of other things that get added to this, but these are at the core 4 essential characteristics of evangelicals. I think to add to that it's important for us to say that evangelicalism is a renewal movement of what had been sort of state-run nationalist churches, even in the 1700s, churches that had come over from Europe with the colonies and had just reproduced the the fairly rigid, cerebral, state-run, formalized churches that Europe had. And so evangelicalism is a renewal movement. It's an attempt to get at what is really at the heart of the faith, not just in the organization of the church as an ethnic or a social community. And I think that's part of the story of the First Great Awakening from the 1730s to the 1780s that we talked about last week. In the colonies, this is something that we don't really talk about all that much, but in the colonies in early America, the churches here were established churches. In other words, they were churches that were governed and funded by the state, by the local government. And there were Congregationalist churches in New Hampshire and Connecticut and in Massachusetts. There were Church of England, literally Church of England churches that came under the authority not only of the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, but of whoever the British governor was in that colony. After the Revolution, those become Episcopal churches, since we have our revolution to gain independence. But they're still state-established churches, even after the Declaration of Independence. In Maryland, you had Catholics, and there were a few rebel states that practiced religious freedom among the 13 colonies, one of those being Pennsylvania and the other one being Rhode Island. So all of these established churches in the colonies predated the Constitution and our First Amendment. So if you're wondering, how could there be established government-run churches in America? Well, they're in America before there's an America. They are the colonial state churches. And the First Amendment, of course, teaches, among other things, that the state support of religion is not what America was going to be. But that change didn't happen overnight. Each state, each colony that had an established church had to work this out within their own boundaries for themselves and in their own time. Now, we're going to get to a couple of really long words here, but that process is called disestablishment. It is literally de-establishing, unestablishing these churches that have these close ties to state government. It was literally detaching the churches from the state government. And there was a movement to prevent disestablishment, which gives us the longest official word in the English language: Anti-Disestablishmentarianism. Okay, anybody heard that word before? Just give me a hand there. Yeah, okay. It's usually a Jeopardy question because you could never really write it on that little screen. But anti-disestablishmentarianism was the conservative move to prevent the separation of church from state. And but like I said, this process happened in each of the states, and it happened in their own time. It took until 1833, that's 44 years after the Constitution was ratified, for Massachusetts finally to cut the state government's ties with the Congregationalist church in Massachusetts. So we think of things in these hard edges, the Constitution is there, and all of a sudden, everybody knows the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and, the other amendments, but the actual living into those amendments happened over time. And so evangelicalism is responding to this state control of churches with a freer, more enthusiastic, more emotional expression of Christian faith. So as the partnership with the government came to an end, it accelerated this renewal movement among churches, and it created, to use economic terms, it created a free market for churches. People could choose their own church, as opposed to the state-controlled form of church life that had been there before. It created a free market, and without that controlled or even coerced membership, you could not own property or hold public office in Massachusetts unless you were the member of a church. So there's a coercion, a coercive role that the state-controlled churches had. And so without that, people could choose their own religious traditions. That's how I'm Italian, but I'm not Catholic. And it's how I know a couple of you are Dutch and you're not Dutch Reformed. There's a few Germans here and you're not Lutheran, you're coming to a Presbyterian church. We have the freedom to go outside of our own ethnic or heritage boundaries and choose whichever church tradition suits us and that we want to be committed to. And so people get to choose their church family now. And that led to preachers seeking to grow their audience and grow their churches because they couldn't count on all the Dutch people in town coming to their Dutch Reformed church. The Scottish people couldn't count on all the Scots coming to the local Presbyterian church. And God forbid, even the Germans would go to other churches instead of just being Lutheran. So this free market created an atmosphere where people were choosing churches because they liked the preacher. It's not like that happens now, but it's one of the things that marked this transition. And a lot of them chose no church, but they got caught up in the evangelical preaching that might happen out at the field or in the street or in a courtyard somewhere. And they came to faith, but maybe never joined a church or didn't join one of the churches that already existed. They chose to create one themselves. So this is an interesting development. This is part of the renewal movement that comes along with evangelicalism. Evangelicalism finds a gap in the marketplace as the state churches become disconnected from state government. And as that happens, you see a realignment of people who are Christians and in their church affiliations. I hope that part makes sense. That's an important historical, sociological, kind of even a little bit theological change that happens alongside the transition from the colonial period to the early republic. And then once the republic is established, you have this new movement that we're going to talk about tonight as the Second Great Awakening. But I have one other thing that this is kind of for fun for me, but we talked about early evangelicals last week, about John and Charles Wesley and about George Whitfield. And for the sake of time last week, I left out something that I really wanted to share. George Whitfield went back to London, and again, as the most famous preacher in the known world at the time, and he established a church in Tottenham Court Road in what wasn't central London then, but is central London now. That church seated about 4,000 people. That's a big church. I have done services in St. Paul's Cathedral. When it's fully seated, it's about 2,400 people. So this huge church on a corner with gardens outside. It was a less developed area back then. That church seated about 4,000 people before it burned down. And then another church about half that size was built on that same site. And in 1890, that church was torn down and another smaller church was built there. And that church was destroyed by a V-2 rocket on Palm Sunday in 1945. In 1957, a modest church was built on that site. It's still called the Whitfield Memorial Chapel. And I'm going to show you a picture of it. There's a point to this. This is Whitfield Memorial Chapel. It is in Tottenham Court Road in a very busy part of, if you walk about, if you're looking at the church this way and you turn left and you walk down Tottenham Court Road, you get to Oxford Street, which if you've been to London, you know that's the busy shopping area there. So this church was built in 1957. In 1976, this church became the home of the American Church in London. And in 2013, their pastor, who happened to be me, decided that because we had about 30 countries represented in the congregation on any given Sunday, that we should change our name to the American International Church. And that's what they're called now. I was the pastor of this church for about 9 years. And I'm just going to do this because this is an old picture with the old name. You can see, hopefully, that it says the American Church in London. And this is my name right here. I just found this online earlier today, and so I wanted to show it to you. This is Whitfield Memorial Chapel. There is an antique portrait of George Whitfield inside, complete with cross eyes, because he was cross-eyed. And this is the church that memorializes George Whitfield and his ministry right there in central London. So I'm going to stop share now because that's enough self-indulgence on my part. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the next chapter of this renewal movement called Evangelicalism. We're fast forwarding into the early 1800s. George Whitfield dies in the later 1700s, and a new generation of church leaders and non-church leaders, but of preachers, come on the scene in America and beginning and are the engine that drives the Second Great Awakening. So there's some key differences between the First Great Awakening, which happens during the colonial period, and the Second Great Awakening, which is about 100 years later in the early 1800s. The First Great Awakening impacted people who had been raised as Christians already. It energized people who were in traditions in the colonies that had become sort of institutions, but not active, thriving churches. And so the leaders like George Whitfield and the Wesleys and Jonathan Edwards up in New England, they re-energized churches that already existed, and probably some new people came to faith. But the First Great Awakening really impacts people who were Christians already, shaking them out of these dead traditions and highly structured church traditions and worship traditions, and allowed for more emotion and experience. The First Great Awakening was geographically small, but it went deep in the ways that it transformed what would become American Christian theology. The Second Great Awakening didn't change as much of American theology, but it covered a much wider geographical area, and it brought hundreds of thousands of people who would have been classified as non-practicing Christians into the Christian church and into Christian communities. The Second Great Awakening leads to all kinds of social reforms. The Second Great Awakening is part evangelistic, but it never gives up or loses sight of the fact that it was meant to make God's kingdom look more like God's kingdom. And so evangelicals in the early 1800s and really until the years after the Civil War were very involved in service to the poor. They were involved in women's rights, which will surprise many of you. They were involved in the temperance movement, which was an attempt to get people to stop drinking. They reached their success with prohibition in the early 20th century, which gives rise to organized crime and all kinds of other things until they finally repeal that and everybody had a drink. But especially the evangelicals in the early 1800s were focused on abolition, the abolition of slavery. Slavery had already been abolished or was in the process of being abolished in Great Britain through the work of another English evangelical, William Wilberforce. And so there were all these movements: service to the poor, abolition of slavery, women's rights, and the temperance movement, all led or significantly supported by evangelical Christians in America in the 1800s. And so that's happening. But the essence of evangelical preaching and the revival that we call the Second Great Awakening was still in preaching. And just like last week, we're going to focus on the most important preacher of that day, and that's a man named Charles Grandison Finney, Charles Finney. Some of you will have heard of him. Charles Finney was born in 1792, so he's just becoming an adult and coming into his profession as a pastor, actually as a lawyer first, until his own conversion experience, after which he became an evangelist. He actually still had court dates on the books when he decided to become a preacher instead. And someone challenged him in the street and said that he was due in court at 10 o'clock that day. And Finney says something typically Finney-ish, which is, I have a cause that I have to go and make that is greater than your cause, so I will not be in court today. And he begins a preaching ministry that is dramatic and that continues to impact preachers today. We're going to talk a little bit about that right now. He is known as the father of modern revivalism. He was a Presbyterian minister who early in his ministry rejected Calvinism and believed that people had the choice, the free choice, to choose their faith. Grace came from God, but getting someone in position to accept that grace and be a recipient of that grace, that was something that required human energy. That's a huge difference from the ways that Protestant churches operated before that. And so it's a change that began in the First Great Awakening, but really comes to wide fruition in the Second Great Awakening. Finney died in 1875 after the Civil War, deep into the time of another chapter in revivalism that we'll talk about next week. So Finney taught that humans played an essential part in the conversion process, in their own conversion and in the conversion of other people. You should be hearing in that conversionism and activism. He was a deeply biblical teacher and preacher. He is known for having developed techniques for stirring up the emotions and energizing crowds, leading to mass conversions to evangelical Christian faith. He called these new measures, quote unquote, new measures, new ways to get people to hear a sermon and be so troubled by it or moved by it that they would make a decision for faith. There is a history of modern revivalism that is a standard book for historians, and it draws a straight line between Charles Finney and Billy Graham. That the history of modern revivalist evangelical Christianity begins with Finney, and it draws a straight line right through to the ministry of Billy Graham. He called these new measures, and preachers all over the country started to use them in their ministries. I think one of the things we have to remember is that evangelicals then and now came with a hard-edged belief that people who were not converted to Christian faith would spend eternity in hell. We have ways of kind of understanding that differently in the modern era, and we can at times even roll our eyes or sneer at that these days, but they have some pretty important texts of the Bible on their side in this viewpoint, and we have to wrestle with that. We're called to make disciples of all nations, and that is the life verse of the evangelical movement. We are called to go out and make disciples of all nations. But in any case, the motivation of evangelical preachers was to convince people that they needed to be saved and to preach the gospel that Jesus was the one doing the saving. And so evangelicalism comes first as a stirring of the heart and a concern for what they called the lost, people who had not made a decision to follow Jesus Christ at that time. Just like last week, I'm going to read you an extended quote from one of Charles Finney's sermons. Hear these words from Charles Finney. Have any of you made God's advocacy sure by committing all to him? If you have, he has attended to your cause because he has secured your pardon. And the evidence you have is your peace of mind? Has he attended to your cause? Have you the inward sense of reconciliation, the inward witness that you believe that you are already forgiven, that you are accepted, and that Christ has undertaken for you, and that he has already prevailed and secured for you a pardon, and given in your own soul the peace that God, the peace of God that passeth understanding to rule in your heart? It is a striking fact in Christian experience that whenever we really commit our cause to Jesus, he without delay secures our pardon, and in the inward peace that follows, gives us the assurance of our acceptance that he has interposed his blood, that his blood is accepted for us, that his advocacy has prevailed, and that we are saved. That is Charles Finney bringing the word. Now, that's not exactly the way I would preach that text, and those aren't the words necessarily that I might use, but I think we stray too far from the invitation to invite other people into the faith. We do that at our peril. And I think, not our immortal peril, I just mean we do that as, I think we sidestep too much of the faith as written if we don't take that part seriously to share what we believe with other people. And I think at the heart of evangelicalism, whatever else it became in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, whatever else it became, it started with this big, massive heart for people to come to faith in God, for people to experience that pardon and that peace that passes understanding, that sense of reconciliation and inward peace that Finney talks about here. Alongside Finney, there were some evangelicals who truly changed and transformed many parts of American life and society during that period of our history. I'm just going to say a couple of sentences about these. If you write the names, and even if you just Google the names, you'll learn something about these folks who are our ancestors in the faith. Jonathan Blanchard. Sorry, I got to mute one person. Jonathan Blanchard was an evangelical leader who worked very hard in his life to abolish slavery. He was also the founding president of Wheaton College in Illinois. And he believed, and I found this quote today, that slaveholding is not a solitary sin, but a social sin. In other words, he saw not just the sin of the slaveholder, but the sin of a society that allowed slavery. And if you're looking to find connections for the best of what Christians have been talking about over the last few years, you've got to go back to Blanchard and a century before him, because there were people who were saying the things that we have been saying in this century back then. He believed that slaveholding was not a solitary sin, but a social sin. I believe Amy Stapp in our church is a Wheaton grad. Wheaton remains one of the best of the evangelical colleges in this country. Charles Finney, back to him, said that wherever he had the authority to do it, he would refuse slave owners the privilege of taking communion with him, because he felt so strongly that that was a preventing sin for them to take the sacrament. Finney, after his preaching career, or really as he began to mature as an older teacher, he taught at Oberlin College in Ohio. Anybody know Oberlin? Oberlin was one of the first colleges in America to admit Black students, and regularly admitted students of color and also women in the mid 1800s. So Charles Finney, again, is one of these people who worked hard to transform American society. There are a whole group of Wesleyan Methodist evangelicals who were champions of women's rights in the late 1800s, after having spent a generation working alongside dynamic, effective women in the abolition movement. And so that became they worked alongside them. the abolition movement was very much had women and men involved in it. And after the Civil War, Methodists in particular, Methodist evangelicals, were champions of women's rights. Early suffrage protests and other agitating for women to have the right to vote, but also to work outside the home, to get educations, to have professions. Evangelicals were at the forefront of creating all kinds of social service organizations, serving the poor, serving orphans. We saw that as far back as Whitfield in the 1700s, serving alcoholics, and also serving immigrants in the cities. So evangelicals didn't just preach a doom and gloom, turn or burn kind of gospel. They lived it in American society. And a lot of the things that they start, the American Bible Society, started by evangelicals, takes donations, but distributes Bibles for free all over the country and all over the world, and uses their money also to fund more accurate translations of the Bible. These are organizations, old organizations that were started by evangelicals. I spent 6 years working for Union Rescue Mission in LA. That's a later rescue mission, but the rescue mission movement started by evangelicals as a way to serve and to take care of the urban poor. But for all of this progressive work, and even in the light of evangelical leadership in the abolition movement, the issue of race and racism never goes away. Black participation in evangelical churches actually declined during the Second Great Awakening to almost zero, for reasons of discrimination or segregation or having to worship in a separate part of the church. Even as they agitated for slaves to be freed and for slavery to be made illegal, they still didn't want those people in their churches. And so we continue to be dogged by this chronic problem, not just in American history, but in particular for us, as we're studying this, in American evangelical history, in American Christian history. One thing I should say is that this distinction about evangelicals isn't as clear in the 1800s. If you were a Christian attending an active church, you were part of evangelical culture in the 1800s. One of the readings that the credit students have been looking at for the class has an essay in it. And this essay begins with this sentence: "The story of American evangelicalism is the story of America itself in the years between 1800 and 1900, for it was evangelical religion which made Americans the most religious people in the world, molded them into a united nation, and spurred them on to heights of social reform, missionary endeavor, and imperialistic expansionism that make up a big part of the history of our country." In other words, evangelical culture is American culture in the 1800s. And so as a response to this segregation and discrimination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded in Philadelphia in 1816 and remains one of the largest African-American denominations in America. So the evangelicals of the 1800s spread the gospel message far and wide. They used new kinds of movements, like getting people excited, whipping them up with really great music, and then putting the people who looked most anxious up in front so everyone would see them. Actually, Charles Finney called this the anxious bench. It was the place where you put the ones who were getting all weepy about the sermon, you put them in front so everyone saw them and more people would respond that way. This is one of the ways that Finney developed very scientific, very manipulative methods for getting people whipped up into a frenzy, and led to thousands of converts to Christianity. So the evangelicals in the 1800s spread the message of the gospel using new kinds of methods. They led progressive movements that made life better and more free for slaves, for women, for the poor. They still couldn't translate all of that, all of what they preached into a more integrated society. But they did break the church and break the state churches out of their sleepy traditions and their separation from the wider needs of society. And so, like most things, you can't look back at just about anything and say it was all good or all bad. There are a handful of things that qualify, but most things are a little bit of both. And evangelicalism is like that. 19th century America is unrecognizable apart from evangelicalism. The abolition movement probably wouldn't have been there in the same way that it was. Some of these other social movements that we know and understand as part of our history. The earliest version of a social service system in this country was established by evangelicals, not by the state. And so we've got to look back. It's one thing just to say, oh, they're, to dismiss them as racists or people who just believe everybody else is going to hell, or all these other things that are easy, nice little tidy bows that we can put on them. But it's more complicated than that. And thankfully, it's a lot better than that. Some of those things are true, but all of these other things are true too. And so they couldn't translate a lot of what they preached into helping make a more integrated society, but they broke the church out of some old ways and old traditions and led to the churches that many of us have experienced during our lifetimes. So on the one hand, hundreds and thousands of people came to faith and a sense of call to make the nation a better place through evangelical preaching. On the other hand, the massive growth of evangelicalism in America created the impression that America was only for evangelicals. And that has led to a lot of what has happened in the years since. It is evangelicals who end up having the hardest time in the late 1800s and early 1900s with immigration, because they bring Catholicism, they bring some of those state church traditions back into the country. And so shamefully, one of the founders of Fuller Seminary, there's an early picture of him at an anti-Catholic rally. And so this is a troubled history, which is why we're having the class. If it was nice and tidy, we'd be talking about something else. So, but still, I think that evangelicals back then would be disappointed in the way that they're perceived today, the way that they show up in that graph that I showed at the beginning of our class today. And I think we'll see over the next few weeks how that changed and why that changed. But also we'll see that no matter what else the excesses of evangelicalism are in any particular era, there is always a core of evangelicals that are working to make their world a better place. Now, the era I know best is the era before and after World War II, but we've got a century to get through before we get there. Next week, we will look at a key post-Civil War evangelical named Dwight Moody. And for those of you who've ever been to Chicago, you know Moody Bible Institute. Some of you may have listened to Moody Bible Radio when you were younger. It was one of the first nationally known Christian radio programs. I'm just going to tell you a little story about this. Moody's always been a conservative Christian school. But Moody Bible Institute has always been a servant to its community. It was in downtown Chicago. For those of you who know the history of Chicago, you know that there were some horrible government housing projects in the city. One of the worst was called Cabrini Green. Anybody who lived in the Midwest probably knows about the Cabrini Green housing project. It was not far from the Moody campus. And it was a place where if you weren't from there, you would not want to be caught walking alone there before or after dark. Moody Bible Institute was, over a long period of time, such an effective servant to the people of Cabrini Green, that the reputation was, if you had a Moody Bible sweatshirt on, you could walk through Cabrini Green and nothing would happen to you. Not because of some magical power or force field that caused by the sweatshirt, but because they knew that your community had served them faithfully when no one else cared about them. And so we're going to talk about the guy who started that school next week. And then we're also going to spend some time learning about a system of understanding the Bible and the world that has led to, in my opinion, much of what we can't stand about fundamentalism and separatist evangelicalism. So that's next week. That's the teaser for next week. And so now I'm going to do the riskiest thing I do every week. And that's, I'm going to take you all off mute. Now, remember, if you're off mute, you still need to manage your ambient sounds around there, okay? And that way, just out of respect for all the folks, I am going to ask you to unmute, and you will need to respond to that.
John,
Who's got a comment or a question?
I remember at Princeton, we read a lot of Finney. And like you said, he did a lot of traveling and he did a lot of preaching, and people were swooning and you know, talk about emotionalism. I mean,
yeah,
really tied the emotionalism part. You didn't talk about too much, just a little bit, but there's a lot of that in his preaching.
Yeah. Yeah, and he actually publishes a book in 1835 called Lectures on Revival, where it's like a manual for how to whip up the crowd into a frenzy, and to get people to respond to the gospel message. Now, when I say that, that sounds more cynical than I mean it to sound. I'm just listening to myself describe that. You've got to understand, people who were accustomed to coming to a worship service that might involve a set liturgy and a sermon, maybe in your language, maybe in the language of the host or the home country of that tradition, and then you leave. And so all of this was new. The things that I teach when I teach a preaching class, these are new things. And I'm not a Finney guy, but I do tell people to watch the way they talk and to manage their pace and pitch and pauses so that people will listen to them. And so having a method of communication is not necessarily just a cynical thing. But man, when you read Finney, it's hard not to get to that conclusion. Yes, please, Charlotte.
Actually, I was from Northern Illinois, about 80 miles west of Chicago. And my Uncle Bruce Spencer, went to Moody Bible Institute, and we went to visit, and they lived in like a tenement housing in that area. Very poor, but everybody else was poor there.
Yeah.
And he went on to work with Child Evangelism Fellowship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I went to Wheaton College with Youth for Christ.
Oh, you did? Wow. Yeah. I have, I did some of my dissertation research at the archives at Wheaton College, because they have every Evangelicals papers there. And I also, back 5 years ago or so, gave a paper at a gathering there. It's a beautiful campus, and lots of Cubs fans, but that's probably just a regional
Chicago.
Let me just look to the second page here, but anybody have a question or a comment that they want to throw in? So I'm trying to go a little bit more date-free and sort of, you know, the things that everybody complains about from their high school history classes. And what I'm trying to do is give us kind of a big sense of the people and the ideas that make this movement so important and I think interesting.
Mhm.
So
Agree.
any questions or comments as we get closer to the top of the hour? Yeah, Anna, please.
Hi, this is just fascinating, and I'm very touched by all this early work that evangelicals did for, helping women and the poor and reaching out. It sounds like a very inclusive kind of a thing, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say in the coming sessions as far as how today so many folks who describe themselves as evangelical are very rigid and exclusionary in it seems like to me anyway, just as a casual observer of the media. So I'm very interested to hear about, what's going on.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. That you're right that some folks will sound that way. It's a huge movement, and it has no, like I said in the beginning, it has no central theological system, or it has no central leader. It has no pope, right? It's a patchwork. It is historians of evangelicalism over the last 50 years have always tried to find the right metaphor, and they've talked about a quilt, and quilts are connected, but they're very separate, right? If you're looking at the seams, one person very generously refers to it as a kaleidoscope with beautiful pieces that move around and form something bigger that's beautiful. But and so
Somebody's talking and they shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's okay. I think it might be somebody behind somebody else, but yeah, Cliff, please.
So the four tenets of evangelicalism still hold today, even though they don't have a central coordinated system. Those tenets still provide a framework, right?
Yeah, I think, and remember, they are a framework for assessing and analyzing movements to see if they fit within the evangelical kaleidoscope.
Okay.
So when I started my studies with David Bevington, it was about 1998 or so, and the book had been published 10 or 15 years before. It really had currency. Everybody that wrote about evangelicalism had to at least address that definition. One of the things I found was that groups that were just starting out were choosing the Bevington definition as a way of planning a group, not just externally kind of assessing a group. In other words, if this is helpful, it's always been a descriptive of evangelical movements, but there were people gathering without this structure, without shared theology, without a pope, and using it as a prescriptive. In other words, saying we're going to form our organizations and we're going to focus on biblicism and conversionism and activism and the significance of the cross. And so he was quite touched to know that. He was a little bit worried about that. He's a pure historian. He only wanted to do analysis, not anybody's group for them. But yeah, I think it does still hold now. And it's a good filter through which to see some of the excesses of this, because very honestly, not everybody who brands themselves as an evangelical really fits within the historical definition of evangelicalism. And so that's something that we'll get to as we move into more of the modern era. Yes, Tad, please.
So I wish I had enough sense not to say this, but then I wouldn't be me. When I think of that graph you had with the 4 circles, wouldn't you expect the exact same type of graph if it was Islam instead of evangelical? And you don't have to respond to that. That's just a thought in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a correlation, not really a relationship between those two. Yeah, I think, and maybe it has a lot to do with the way both of those groups, evangelicals and Muslims, are presented in the culture. And all of us who are willing to say things that aren't necessarily the popular way to say this, some of it's earned by both groups. Like you can't get away from the fact that every once in a while something explodes and there you are. But it's a tiny group of Muslims who cause that impression for the whole group. It might not be tiny, but it's a small group of evangelicals who create this negative impression of evangelicalism. I think we'll find when we start talking about who real evangelicals are in our culture, I think we'll find that even if we have theological differences with them, we might see them still as positive, contributing, loving Christians in our culture. Most of us have had some contact with World Vision, or maybe with Fuller Seminary, or with somebody mentioned Youth with a Mission, Youth for Christ. All of these organizations that have sprung up in the 20th century are rooted in the evangelicalism of the 1800s. And so, Linda, I think I saw your hand there for a second.
Yeah, thank you. I grew up in an evangelical church, and there was a lot of emphasis on what was referred to as the 4 spiritual laws. And there was a tract that we were to give to people that said, "Have you heard of the 4 spiritual laws?" I don't recall what they were, but I'm wondering if each of those 4 related to the 4 tenets that you've been talking about.
Yeah, they don't. It's just the penchant for liking to think of having lists of 3 or 4 things that are easy to remember. But one of the evangelical parachurch organizations called Navigators developed the 4 spiritual laws and handed it out as a tract. And I don't remember the other ones, but I know the first one. Do you know that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life?
Right, exactly.
That's the first one. And it's, my memory does not allow me to remember the other 3, but they're easily found on the Google. But those organizations, think about those again. You know, Navigators was highly evangelistic. World Vision, same profile of participants, but people who are deeply involved in providing water for people that don't have water, and food for people that don't have food. An organization that is near and dear to my heart, International Justice Mission. Another one rooted in evangelical culture, but which works to free people from various kinds of slavery in developing countries. And they do amazing work, deeply rooted in the evangelical tradition. And so we'll get to those. We're teasing out what I'm going to do in the 9th or 10th week, but there's good stuff out there. And a lot of them, the vast majority of them, weren't on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. We're not. Yeah, Steve.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think last week you talked about growing up in a Presbyterian church that was also evangelical. So I'm assuming the Presbyterian church didn't advertise itself as being an evangelical church. That would be your description of the mores of the church. Is that correct? I mean,
so here's how that happens in Southern California, and it's unique to churches that were within the orbit of Fuller Seminary. And Fuller Seminary started by a fundamentalist preacher named Charles Fuller, who was also a wonderful person. And when I say fundamentalist, we're going to have to get to a tighter definition of that later on too. But Charles Fuller had a radio program in the 20s and 30s that reached maybe 30 million people a week.
Wow.
There were people, there's a story about a soldier in World War II hearing a familiar hymn and going up to this upstairs room and finding a group of GIs around a radio listening to Charles Fuller's program. And we're going to get, I don't want to tease out the parts that I'm going to talk a lot about later on, but let me just get back to your point, which you're going to have to remind me of, because I just got myself confused talking
well,
about
the Presbyterian church
yeah.
that was evangelical, but not advertising it as such.
And I think that was true. And I think for a lot of the churches, and I'm looking at Luann. Luann grew up in a church like this, probably in Southern California too. They were very much impacted by Fuller Seminary, which was a creative, innovative place in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and had a huge impact. And for a while, the Presbyterian Church wouldn't accept Fuller graduates as pastors. But the pastor I grew up with, who had gone to Princeton, did his doctoral work at Fuller and brought Fuller professors and students into the mix. And for those of you who don't know this part of our training, we do our degree to become a pastor. And part of it is you do what's called field education. In other words, you go work at a church to be mentored by a pastor who's already done this work. And most of us ended up doing youth work, but you do all kinds of ministries. Well, when you live within 20, 30 miles of a seminary, you have a deep talent pool to draw on. And so I grew up with youth leaders who were all Fuller students at my Presbyterian church. And many of them became the next generation of great youth leaders in the 70s and 80s. And they were huge. They had a huge impact on me, men and women, by the way. That my 10th grade youth leader was a young woman who is just a recently retired pastor in Colorado, Kathleen Fox. And she was wonderful to me. We played guitar together. I credit her every time I credit people who had an impact on my life and ministry. So we would have considered ourselves part of that. They read some of the same books as evangelicals did in other traditions, but they were Presbyterians. You know, on the dark side, they also read Hal Lindsey. We're going to talk about that next week. They read a bunch of other stuff they probably ought not to have been reading that screwed them up for a generation, but that's a different story. I think we're past the hour. Anthony, can I push your question to when we're in the seminar?
No problem.
All right, thank you. Any final comments or pot shots anybody wants to take? Charlotte.
Yeah, we had Ed Giroux as a pastor here at our church in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was a graduate of Fuller.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. It was a different thing because Fuller graduates did not come out as rigid Presbyterians.
Right.
Because the seminary is not a Presbyterian seminary. At Princeton, they train you to be a Presbyterian pastor. At Fuller, they train you to be a pastor. You got to figure out the Presbyterian part when you go do it. So that's shorthand, but it's kind of true. Let me close us in prayer, and I'll let you guys get on with the rest of your evening. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for as I said before, the people who have gone ahead of us, the people who shape our own lives and ministries, whether we know it or not. We thank you for the many nameless people in these histories who cared for the poor, who worked for the abolition of slavery, who worked for women to have equal rights, and who tried to make this country a better reflection of its own documents and dreams. And so as we continue to learn how our country was shaped by a group of Christians, give us a sense of softness as we hear about their good things and their bad things. We ask all of these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.